I should say that this is really the British version of the forthcoming American presidential debates, although Roger Scruton is infinitely more intelligent than Mitt Romney, and I am infinitely more left-wing than Barack Obama, neither of which is at all difficult. I want just to begin by very quickly sketching in 4 momentous developments in culture, as I see it, over about the last 100 years. It won't take as long as that makes it sound, yes, but it will. The first is, in the early 20th century, something very dramatic happens to culture, namely, it becomes for the first time, really, a full-blooded industry. Yes? The so-called culture industry, as people like Adorno will later call it, gets off the ground. In other words, culture really, for the first time in a very big way, becomes part of commodity production in general. Yes? Now, second momentous development, which is really in line with this and extends it, several decades later, perhaps in the 1970s, the era of so-called postmodernism, now not only is culture itself a huge industry, enormously profitable, but other industries, other parts of society begin increasingly to assimilate and integrate it, become, as it were, culturalized or aestheticized in style, design, packaging, advertising, public relations, and so on. What happens then is an intensifying integration of culture and other kinds of social practice, which has the advantage, you might say, that it brings culture down to earth from its rather rarefied status otherwise, but has the distinct disadvantage that it means that culture gradually ceases to operate as critique. That one of the great traditional humanistic functions of culture was, as it were, to open up some daylight between itself and the rest of our social practices and institutions so that it could actually operate as a critique of them. That distance, as it increasingly narrows between culture and society, if you like, means that critique is increasingly muted and blunted, and that happens just in our own period at the same time as another dramatic event, a historic event, which is that the universities finally more or less cease to be centres of humane critique and capitulate almost without a struggle to the priorities of late capitalism. Yes? Those two things, the integration of culture, the culture ceasing to be a critique, and the universities increasingly capitulating these priorities, I think can be seen together. I was, about a year ago, being shown around what I was told was the greatest, the biggest anyway, maybe not greatest, university in South Asia by the president, who was proudly pointing out his business school and managerial courses and so on. And I said, there doesn't seem to be anything critical here. And he looked at me as though I'd said, you know, where are the PhDs on pole dancing? And he said, your comment will be noted rather stiffly, took out some small technological gadget, spoke 2 words into it, probably, you know, kill him, closed it and put it away. Right. The third momentous development, which I think Roger in particular may want to engage with, is when culture ceases to be a surrogate for religion. Yes? You can write the history of modernity, among other things, in terms of a whole series of botched attempts by various things, the nation, the state, culture, and so on, to stand in for a failing religion. Culture was, in a way, a very plausible candidate, both culture in the narrow artistic sense and culture in the broader way of life, anthropological sense. What happens over the 20th century, I think, is that this becomes less and less plausible. The idea that the arts will save us, which in some ways is a theme of modernism, a theme of high modernism, is as it were, gradually discredited. There is an excellent book, actually not yet published, about to be published on this theme, full of brilliant insights, called Culture and the Death of God, written by me, which looks at this whole... in a rather dramatic way, culture made a bid for power, a bid, as it were, to oust God, to oust theology and religion. And that, wasn't a stupid idea, because culture is concerned with deep fundamental values, if you like, with a kind of transcendence, as well as with everyday practices like religion. It was in some ways a very plausible candidate to replace religion, but it didn't work for all kinds of reasons. The fourth dramatic development over that century, I think, is this, that let me put it this way, at a certain point, culture ceased to be part of the solution and became part of the problem. What I mean by that is that one rather generous-minded but somewhat hopelessly idealist version of culture had seen culture as the common ground on which we could all meet in our fundamental shared humanity, regardless of our rather trivial differences of gender, nationality, ethnicity, class, and so on. That was a rather abstract concept, and you needed to concretize it. You needed something you could, as it were, hold in your hand and say, this crystallizes, this distills those deep shared values. And the name of that was literature. Literature was a marvelously portable way, so to speak, of carrying this deep consensus of values around you. That was, in many ways, a very generous-minded and progressive idea in its time. What happens from the mid-20th century onwards is that that, too, becomes increasingly unviable. And the reason for that, I think, is this. The most wildly successful revolutionary movement of the modern period was revolutionary nationalism, which in the mid-decades, particularly of the 20th century, transfigured the earth, yes? For revolutionary nationalism, and for the various kinds of identity politics, so-called, that came after it, culture was now, as it were, part of the problem, not part of the solution. Culture in the broad sense of identity, language, symbol, daily practice, kinship, tradition, affiliation, community, all of these things were now politically problematic. Yes, they were the very language of conflict and contention, whereas culture traditionally, sometimes I think rather spuriously, had been an attempt to paper over those cracks and say, well, those divisions are not really as important as our shared humanity. What happened then was that culture became, as it were, the very language in which political demands were framed and articulated. Culture and politics became much closer together, and that meant that culture could no longer, as it were, take the high ground in relation to a politics which it had always been rather disdainful of, or rather suspicious of. In a word, and forgive me if you've heard me say this before, culture was now, and is for us today, what people are ready to kill for, or, if you like, to die for. Nobody, as far as I know, is prepared to kill for the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Maybe a few seriously weird people hanging around in caves somewhere, but they are most certainly prepared to kill for questions of religion, identity, community, ethnicity, lineage, and so on. Yes? That now, I think, is what has happened in the long trek from the beginning of the 20th century to the present. Culture is what people are prepared to kill for, and on that suitably somber note, I will hand you over to Roger Scruton, who will probably depress you even more.
Well, that was an extremely interesting survey of a particular view of what culture is and what it can do for us. I want to slightly change the focus towards thinking about how we actually would try to teach culture in the age in which we find ourselves, and why it might still be important. Terry has said some very important things, in fact, about the history of the culture industry in the last century. And I can't say that I disagree with everything that he says, although I think there's one very important remark that he makes which I would fundamentally disagree with, which is that his remark that the universities have capitulated to capitalism. As a unique defender of capitalism in my university, for which I was never rewarded, I can only say that that's the opposite of the truth. Where I taught in London University, everybody in the humanities departments and social sciences had capitulated to socialism. Many of them under the influence of Terry Eagleton. This put me in mind of a very important question, which is not only what is culture, but why should we teach it now, and how can we teach it? This is very important for people in the humanities, because that's how we defined our subjects. You know, Terry taught and still teaches literature, which is, I guess, a part of culture. I teach philosophy, in particular those aspects of philosophy that border on the arts. And there is no point in teaching them if I don't think that there is something to be learned here. And what I think of there is to be learned is precisely that, culture. But what is it? I think there are two contrasting views, one which I defend, and one which I think Terry has defended in his writings over the years. I would say that culture, as we teach it in universities, is or aspires to be a form of wisdom that is to be imparted to people. That's to say, something which contains elements of knowledge which they wouldn't otherwise acquire, and which is imparted in its own particular way, not as the sciences are, but in another way, and it's that other way which is difficult to define. But there are those who teach in universities, in humanities departments, who see culture as something quite different. They see it as part of the ideology of the ruling class, or the ideology of a particular social order. And the purpose of teaching it is not to impart it, but on the contrary, to undermine it, or to expose the powers that secretly advance behind it. And I think that's that second approach is what started what I think of as the culture wars. The wars between those people who regarded their role as teachers of culture as one of imparting a form of wisdom, a form of knowledge that would be not only useful to the student, but part of the continuity of the social order to which the student belongs, and those who see their primary duty as one of debunking, deconstructing, or showing the structures of domination, to use the Foucauldian idiom, that lie behind our ways of thinking, our ways of speaking, and our ways of enjoying the art and music and so on of our civilization. The origin of that second view, the debunking view, is, I think, the Marxist theory of ideology, which became prominent not at the time that Marx wrote, but much later in the Frankfurt School in Germany and between the wars, and, of course, in France of 1968 under the influence of people like Foucault. And I see Terry Eagleton's approach in his earlier writings, at least, as part of that, a particularly intelligent manifestation of it, I'm afraid, so I can't easily triumph over it. But nevertheless, I do think that it's very important to reaffirm another vision of culture as something not only worth imparting, but also as containing knowledge. The kind of knowledge that it contains is not, like scientific knowledge, a collection of facts and theories. And when people start thinking of culture in terms of theory, it's largely because they're taking the Marxist approach of debunking it through finding the explanation of it. I think of culture as a form of practical knowledge, something which gives you a sense of what to do, what to feel, how to be towards other people in a community, in ways which will enhance your own social and emotional competence. I think this is what you learn from literature, and I think in particular you learn it from music. And if I've got just another minute or two, I'd like to mention this aspect of culture because it's so often overlooked. The greatest achievement of our civilization, if you leave religion and science to one side, has been music. A continuous tradition of reflection through the articulate sound on what it is to be human. and a constant attempt to take that reflection further, to build abstract structures in which nevertheless we see mirrored our own emotional nature as rational and social beings. And I think this great achievement is something which I think can be imparted to the young, and it changes their lives. It changes their way not only of thinking about the world, but of seeing each other. Nothing can be done to enhance this acculturation by giving a Marxist theory of where it all came from. Here is something which you impart by encouraging young people to love it and to find reflected in it all that is best in themselves. And that, I think, is what a real cultural education should be, imparting that kind of self-knowing and reflective conception of why one is the sort of thing one is and how to find it mirrored in the world around you. That's it.
Very much for that. Terry, would you like to come back to Roger on some of his points?
Could I sit somewhere where I could see him?
Of course, we swap.
Right, yeah, thank you. Yes, actually, some of that I surprisingly agree with. I think there was a period, particularly perhaps the 1970s and 1980s, when the left was too negative, deconstructive in the bad, in the negative sense. And not sufficiently affirmative about culture. But I think that there's also a very important leftist tradition of that affirmation. You mentioned the Frankfurt School there, Roger, but as it were in connection purely with dismantling and structures of domination. The Frankfurt School, of course, also has a very positive tradition of utopian thought about culture. And so, I think, has the left in general. I mean, Fred Jameson, the greatest, I think, Marxist critic in the States, certainly, is very much concerned with that. There was and what part of the problem, I think, for me, is to get those two approaches in some sort of reasonable alignment. Of course, I don't agree that Marxism or the left has been debunking, nor actually do I that's the point, that is something to be approved of, nor actually do I think that deconstruction is purely negative. That's a rather, if I may say so, cliched view of it. And Derrida himself always insisted that, or as he used to say, you have to be a Parisian to say this, deconstruction says yes. A man who actually on his deathbed left a note read by his son at his funeral saying that life must be affirmed, and asking his friends to smile upon him as he was smiling upon them. These were not the words of a nihilist or a debunker, as those who disgracefully tried to refuse him an honorary degree at the University of Cambridge seem to think. So I'm afraid, in a sense, Roger, I think that your own distinction between culture as a kind of wisdom and culture as an explanation of context is something that, for me, can be deconstructed. I don't think it's an absolute polarity. I believe, in my own way, that culture can convey a kind of wisdom, and that's why people go to it. But I don't think that wisdom is timeless, and I don't think that wisdom is to be uncriticised. And I think that it exists in a historical context. And I think you can do all that without the worst kind of negativity and debunkery.
That's it, yes. There is truth in what you say. I have to say, though, that leaving it to your deathbed to say that life should be affirmed is leaving it rather late. He could have taken a bit of action earlier.
No, it was always like...
Especially if he'd bothered to look at the effect he was having on others. I think that my own sense of this, you're absolutely right that one can get into a whole world of cliches talking about deconstruction and what it meant. But I still think one must hold on to this distinction between culture as a form of knowledge and the theory of culture as a kind of scientific way of distancing oneself from that knowledge. And I think this relates to something you yourself said when you, I think quite rightly said, at a certain stage, culture had been thought of as a religion surrogate, and then gradually it failed to fulfill that role, and people therefore it lost some of its credibility, some of it the reason why we would be teaching it. I think there is truth in that, but nevertheless, that culture, at least in the forms in which we're talking about it, has this in common with religion, that it is offering membership in some way. I think this is a very important feature of it. Science, I don't think, does offer membership. It offers a sort of factual knowledge about the world, but it doesn't say, you belong with this. Whereas part of deconstructing what you say about the historical and context dependence of culture is to say, yes, it's like that because it's telling you here is something that you can belong to. And I think there are forms of knowledge that only come about through belonging. That's why I wanted to refer to music.
Yes, I'm a bit doubtful that scientists wouldn't see themselves as belonging, Roger. I mean, speaking as a total outsider, but observing them like some strange nocturnal creature, the scientists have a powerful sense, often a rather clannish sense of community. For example, they work together in ways that people in humanity often don't. They practically, physically work together. I did some work in theatre in my younger days, and it seemed to me rather like the humanist equivalent of the laboratory. It's practical, it's collective, it's changeable, and so on. Belonging is important, and I think it not least because there's been a somewhat callow cult of the outsider and exile and migrant, as though the truth or wisdom only lies with that. Some post-colonial have been responsible for that. Everybody needs to belong, and there's nothing wrong with roots. Nor, in my view, speaking as a leftist, is there anything wrong with tradition. One thing that we vitally belong to, as you well know and have written, is a tradition. It's just that I think it's been rather arrogantly assumed that tradition, is one thing. But the left has its traditions. The suffragettes, the Chartists are a tradition. But whenever tradition gets talked about on the right, it's as though it's basically about the House of Lords and the changing of the guard. Our traditions are pushed to the edge. And, somebody once said, we leftists have always lived in tradition. His name was Leon Trotsky,
Well, yes, it's easy to say that because, if you say we leftists have always done this, or this is how we think on the left, you know that you're all automatically asserting membership of a well-established community. If I said we rightists, immediately, even if I didn't finish the sentence, I'd be in trouble. Because it's not a permissible form of community. So you're able to lean on this precisely because you've taken refuge in the kind of things, a kind of community which I would think shouldn't exist in the first place.
I want to go back, actually, Roger, to your point that I really do want to take issue with, which is the point about universities. I think that's perhaps the most important issue facing us this evening, or generally. Now, it's true that a lot of people in universities have been valiantly resisting the kinds of directions they've been taken. If that's what you mean by saying you find a lot of hairy lefties in universities, then yes, and in my view, quite a good thing. But what they are but you also, Roger, speak as though you haven't seen the inside of universities since the 1970s.
Really?
No, exactly. I know you haven't. And therefore haven't experienced what any, not only junior, but even senior academic, just the whole soul-destroying managerialization of universities.
Yes, I totally accept that.
Yes.
But I mean, being managerialized by socialists is even worse than being managerialized by capitalists.
But it's the left that stood up for the universities as a humane critique of social priorities. It's the left that has tried to keep those traditions alive, as against the cynicism of neo-capitalists.
Let's assume that there's some truth in what you say. I have to say, I do have a conception that universities have legitimate things that they should be doing, one of which is imparting culture. And there are other things which they do now more and more, which they shouldn't be doing, like teaching people business studies and other technological forms of education. And that is entirely true. It's entirely true. That comes about because of the influence of the surrounding economic order. I don't doubt that. But the question is still, what is taught in those areas where only a university can do it, like the imparting of high culture. Yeah. That's what I was really referring to. Yeah. That is where I have felt that my vision has been radically marginalized and the subject matter confiscated. And I think that it's important to say this and also to emphasize that your reference to tradition is absolutely right. But tradition isn't just about changing the guard and Scottish country dancing and the sort of things that Hobsbawm mocks. It's about things like the unbroken development of the common law down 1,000 years, or the rise of the Western orchestra, the history of tonality from plain song to Wagner, etc. These are huge things which have shaped us as the things that we are.
We're in danger of agreeing to actually.
I know.
You didn't come along to see some,
This is always what happens when I talk. People say to me, "I'm in danger of agreeing with you."
But I do think, you see, the area of agreement is very interesting, isn't it? Because you just said, Roger, I know that you believe this, that you also feel very uncomfortable about the preeminence of business schools and managerialism within, and you have a traditional, as it were, humanistic, conservative conception of universities, with which that jars just as much as it jars with me. There is a certain sense in which a certain kind of rightist, like you, not any old rightist, links arms in that respect with a certain kind of unreconstructed old leftist, not 1,000 years from me. I didn't like Margaret Thatcher, and neither did you.
Oh, compared with all the alternatives, I did. Sorry? She was,
Well, you dismissed her as a market liberal, which is true. You didn't see her as a true Tory.
No, that's true. Yeah, but I've grown up since then.
But she hasn't. But I think given that there's a long tradition of a certain kind of conservatism and a certain kind of leftism, both hitting, as it were, a mainstream bourgeois, capitalist, whatever you like to call it, establishment. The question that then arises for me is this, right? And this for me is a fundamental question in addressing people of your position. Given that you have that sort of distaste for those activities, given that you equally have a distaste for the coarsening and cheapening of cultural life, you nevertheless remain firmly committed to the very economic and political system which, in my view, is largely responsible for that cheapening and diluting and sensationalizing and vulgarizing of culture. That's what I really don't understand.
Well, that's a very good point to make, and I would respond in the following way, that this cheapening and commodification of culture that you rightly criticize is to be observed everywhere, and was to be observed just as much in the so-called socialist states that prevailed in Eastern Europe in my youth and in your youth. It doesn't seem to have been resisted in anywhere by any political action, partly because I think it isn't in itself simply the result of any political decision. It's something that has come about entirely because of prosperity, because of the ways in which people can make easily available the cheaper forms of entertainment without there being any authority to criticize them. And in your view, I mean, if you were in charge, I suspect it would be a bit more you would go back a little bit more towards the Catholic Inquisition about all this, actually examining cultural products and saying, you know, which should we allow?
That's right. Everybody would have to read Brecht 3 times a day.
Yes, that sort of thing. But
Roger, as you know, I'm no defender of the cultural policies of the Soviet Union. I've spent most of my life fighting for Stalinism.
But the problem is, what is the alternative?
Well,
we agree that there's a problem.
Well, I don't think we agree on the definition of the problem. I spent most of my life fighting Stalinism in political terms and also in cultural ones, but I don't agree that the problems of culture under Stalinism are anything like the problems of culture under market society. They're no better. They may well be worse. You know, if you have an authoritarian state telling artists what to write, otherwise they're carted away to prison. Sure, that's actually worse than, you know, the dumbing down of culture under late capitalism. All I'm saying is one has to diagnose 2 different conditions here. And the condition, and what I don't understand about your position, is that the specific forms of vulgarization of culture which exist under capitalism you rightly deplore, and you support the very framework which generates them.
I'm not known for advocating economic theories. I suspect that I would support whatever is necessary by way of economic activity for there to be universities in the first place. But I would agree with your position that universities should be, especially in the humanities, critical vis-à-vis the surrounding order. That is the function of culture. And I think you said that this has ceased to be in some way, but I think it's ceased to be largely because people in universities and in schools have neglected that function of culture, that it should inject into the ordinary way of thinking those critical ideas which enable people to distance themselves from the obvious temptations of economic life.
But I think the distancing is part of the problem there. The way culture and the humanities were actually set up historically, the way if you like, the origin, the modern origin of the humanities or of culture, was in that necessary distancing from themselves from an increasingly industrial society, so that values which were really dysfunctional in that society were increasingly, as it were, expelled and had to be preserved somewhere else. You had to have an enclave which actually preserved these values. You call it the arts or the humanities or university or culture, it doesn't matter. The problem, however, and I think this is, you see that side of it, Roger, and you applaud it, and so do I, but I see another side too. That distance is also crippling. That distance, which is necessary, as it were, to preserve those values in some utopian or residual way, also means it's impossible to bring them actively to bear on social life.
But how would you close the distance without the apparatus of censorship?
You and I both were at the same college in Cambridge and knew each other and knew Raymond Williams, who was my mentor, if you like. Now, when Williams talks about the culture and society tradition, he is indeed talking about figures who want to preserve certain kinds of value from the depredations of industrial capitalism, all the way from almost Burke to Lawrence. But he's also talking, not least in the case of people like William Morris and to some extent Wilde, about people, the point where that tradition as it were, sees that the only way forward is to try to link these values to a political movement. Now, that's where, of course, you will pull back, because a typically conservative view is that culture is one thing and politics is another. If that is the case, I'm afraid there's no way of bringing these values to bear on everyday social practices. That's my problem with this position.
Well, if you think that, then you still have to say what kind of political order would enable these conservative, cultural values to permeate once again the everyday life of ordinary people. And all attempts to make this happen have come a cropper for some of the reasons that you say. Identity politics ends by vulgarizing culture and making it impossible for it to assume a critical stance.
One reason I've said this before, forgive me if you heard it, one reason why I'm a Marxist, quite apart from just enjoying annoying people, is that I don't like to do any work. I don't really like working. Marx's answer to the question you're posing, Roger, surely, is that one of the reasons why people's lives are cultureless or filled with a phony, a bogus kind of culture, is because, we extraordinarily, at this late point in human history, have to invest as much energy in labour, or in making profit because of the nature of our system, that there are simply no energies left. Marx is all about leisure and culture and not about labour, but he thinks that we have to change the system which absorbs so much of our energies there if we're to free those energies. And that's a very respectable kind of William Morris, Oscar Wilde, Marx, they all believe in that.
Yes,
now, that's not a programme. That's not a programme, I agree.
But I would hesitate to accept that because it seems to me that the degradation of our culture, that which at least we would agree is degraded, has come about through increase in leisure. Look at television. It's a leisure industry. It's a leisure product for everybody. It's what they go and sit down in front of it, and it has just declined consistently since the beginning, partly because it doesn't have to make any effort. And look at the decline in popular music from folk music of the 19th century down to today. The folk music of the 19th century, which inspired all the great composers of the early 20th century, was produced by people who really were working very hard. They didn't have any leisure, but they did put their heart and their soul into their singing.
But Roger, again, unfortunately, one point where I think left and right can agree is that, unfortunately for this meeting, is that what's important for a whole Marxist or socialist tradition about art is that it has no immediate, obvious, utilitarian function. Yes? It doesn't get you anywhere.
Yes. It wasn't Marx who first said that, of course. No.
It wasn't. No, indeed it wasn't. But Marx was a closet Aristotelian, and there's certain connections there. Marx loved art and literature and culture exactly because, just by virtue of the kinds of useless things they were, gloriously pointless things they were, they formed a kind of living refutation or critique of a society in which everything is dominated by exchange value, instrumental rationality, and so on. The difference between, I'm sure much of that you would accept, Roger, you too.
Yeah, definitely.
But the difference is that Marx raises that. He says, how do we then bring about a society in which it would be possible, in which human energies, as far as possible, could be expressed as ends in themselves and not be instrumentalized. You may not agree with his answer. My point is, you have to raise the political question for that vision to become viable.
I'm not sure that, in a broad sense of political, there is a political question. Of course, in what kind of society do people understand their own lives and each other as ends in themselves and not as means to something, some endless system of production. That's much older than Marx. That goes back to the Old Testament, of course, that thought. And in a broad sense, it's political. But there is then the question of how you secure, when this has fallen apart, when people have adopted to everything an instrumental attitude, how do you then find your way back? Romantic conservatives like Burke were among the first to raise this question, and the answer that Burke gave is one which I think is still important, namely that this cannot be done from the top, by political imposition or by any revolutionary program which simply forces humanity into an abstract geometry which it can't conform to. It has to be done from below through the association, the free association of individuals who come to respect each other through their shared activities. And that's where art perhaps can do something. But of course, Burke also thought that religion had to be there too.
I think there are four. There's a tiny, rare class of things that are, so to speak, autotelic, that have their ends in themselves, yes? Or to put it, that exist just for the hell of it, to use a technical theological term, yeah? Just for their own self-delight. First is, of course, the greatest of all those is God. You know, God is purely an end in himself. He has his reasons, grounds, ends, motives, etc. himself. Second is a certain view of art, which is always in danger of being hubristic in that respect, of taking the place of God, a certain romantic view of art for which the whole point of art is that it's gloriously pointless. Thirdly is actually, I think, evil, because I think, and there's a remarkably cheap and extraordinarily attractive book, and you know who the author is, on this, which argues that the strange thing about evil, it seems to be wickedness done just for the hell of it. That's why it's so mysterious. And third and fourthly, right, and this brings us to our debate, human beings, as they might be under transformed political conditions, as far as possible. And I think there is a radical romantic tradition in which Marx is very key, but he's by no means the only one, which tries to bring these insights to bear on politics. And that's certainly a major reason why I'm a Marxist.
Yes. All I would say in response to that is that attempts to realise that the programme have always led to a worse situation than the one that needed to be remedied. And secondly, that this may be because it's not that human beings are created by political conditions, but that political conditions are created by human beings. And that we ought to be a bit more attentive to those basic truths about human nature that seem to get dropped from the Marxist worldview.
Well, I've always been a great defender of the idea that Marx believed in a human nature, and he was quite right to do so. He actually called it species being, which is a kind of, if you like, a materialist version of human nature. But Marx, I think, would have rejected that kind of purely pragmatic or instrumental.
But this was why he thought that in the end there wasn't going to be a political program was not going to sort things out. It would be the natural evolution of human society.
Maybe we're getting into a little technical here, but if Marx had believed that, it's strange why he was so concerned with political struggle. You know, why didn't he just lie back?
He was confused, wasn't he?
You think we should?
Yes. We have some questions now from the audience. There are ushers with mics. Please wait for the mics to come to you. And if you're in the gallery, there's a microphone up there. So first of all, we'll take a question from the gentleman there, and then the young man there. Here.
It seems to me that in matters of economics, it makes a lot of sense to be a Marxist, a revolutionary. In matters of politics, maybe a liberal. Maybe a J.S. Mill liberal rather than a Nick Clegg liberal, but nonetheless a liberal. But when it comes to culture, is it not necessarily demanding of a conservative attitude? Because there is a store of accumulated wisdom and products, some of them much more timeless than others, that it seems to me it behoves us to look after, and maybe establish, defend and clarify those values, but not to undermine them, and that the fundamental attitude towards culture, the cultural sphere, has to be conservative, especially in the context of a university. There are, of course, people who are creating new cultural products who fight to get in to that great tradition, and so they should, and we can evaluate their success in doing so. But the job of a university, educating young people, I think must necessarily, should it not, have a conservative attitude to culture?
Well, I'm sorry, but it's almost as though you didn't hear my first response to Roger, where I said I certainly agree that culture is a form of wisdom, or can be, and it's not a form of wisdom you can teach scientifically. But that doesn't mean that it's timeless, That doesn't mean it's non-historical, that doesn't mean it's non-contextual, and that doesn't mean that all traditions are, as it were, pickled in amber, and all we do is faithfully and rather passively transmit them. There is a conservative understanding of tradition, but my point against Roger was there's also a radical understanding of tradition. When Trotsky says, we Marxists always live in tradition, he's not speaking conservatively, because he has a different conception of tradition as something which is constantly remade, which constantly tries to open itself to the participation of more and more people, and so on, which looks different in the light of different circumstances. So I would reject the idea that culture and education are somehow ipso facto conservative. If by conservative you mean they pass something on, sure, of course they do. But what leftist is going to disagree with that?
In support of the question, or rather the statement, I would say there is a work of conservation which you mustn't overlook. Even if you're on the left, there are things that don't make sense if you haven't got that complete historical context. And it's possible to lose cultural knowledge much more easily than it is to gain it. I think, this is one of the important things that has been happening in our time. Loss of knowledge is not an easy thing to describe, but it does happen. Unlike in the sciences, you can put the knowledge in a book and someone will come and refer to it later and recapture it. But to recapture, for instance, the emotional content of the Shakespeare plays when the traditional performance is lost.
Yes. Well, let me say for a third time, I agree with conserving knowledge, but I don't think that's the only function of education by any means, and I think there are legitimate arguments about what you mean by conservation, because just as the left quite properly shouldn't forget about that function, the right shouldn't see conservation in a static and authoritarian way, as it's so often done. But the right has so often said, here are the timeless cultural values, take them or not, right? And that autocratic attitude has been quite as damaging to education and culture, in my view, as those on the left who have ignored the conservatory aspect. When you mention Shakespeare, Roger, I mean, I've spent all my life as a leftist writing on and teaching Shakespeare. So have many other people on the left. It's just that we don't, we see Shakespeare as a rather more living and changing reality than a museum piece, which is the way some conservationist theorists see him.
Yes, but you should notice the extent to which you keep referring to yourself as on the left, as part of a group, something which has, as it were, defined the issue for its own purposes. And you saying that the people on the right insist on this and insist on this, but people on the right don't insist very much at all. And hardly ever identify themselves with that word. And we don't belong to a group. We're not trying to take things over. We're just holding on to what we love.
Well, there's this thing called the Salisbury Review that you used to be.
Yes, so that has a readership of about 1,000 people.
Probably about the same as Socialist Worker.
Next question, please.
The essence of my idea is that it's time to open up the ivory tower. Because 6 years ago, there were bombs in London, in the buses and the underground. And why is it that eminent people, eminent writers like yourselves, I might have not read everything you've written, but why is it that you can't address issues like, for instance, in France and Germany, it's not allowed to be disparaging about the Holocaust history, but it's allowed to print cartoons against Islam because there's no particular context, no particular history behind, or any reasons why we shouldn't not print cartoons against Islam. But this is leading to the question, is it possible for people like you to talk to religious fundamentalists that end up bombing our cities and don't have any means to interpret a very abstract idea of listening to Wagner or reading Shakespeare, that they're not a part of our universe, but they do place bombs in our cities and they have a view of the world which is completely incommensurable with our view of the world. Is there anything we can say to them?
First of all, I You began by talking about the ivory tower, right? I'm very suspicious of that phrase. Not only because today that's the last thing that universities are. Transnational corporations may be, but ivory towers, and haven't been for a very long time. Nor has culture been part of an ivory tower, sequestered from reality for a very long time. If ever, in a sense, I think that's a misleading metaphor. All I would say about let me say two things about the point about fundamentalism. One, of course, is that that's a form of culture. That fits into what I was saying about culture nowadays is something you will kill for. For some people, culture is something you will kill for. It's not simply Balzac and Beethoven. And if you confine your view of culture to a largely aesthetic one, you're not going to be able to understand and engage with that lethal situation. Right? Second thing I just want to say very quickly is this. When Prospero turns to Caliban at the end of The Tempest and says, "This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine," he's making a very old, if you like, partly religious, partly ritual gesture of accepting the dark and misshapen and monstrous thing that hovers terroristically at your gate as part of your own responsibility. The Oedipus standing at Colonus, blind, broken, beggarly, monstrous, and then is taken in. Now, I'm not saying that we should take terrorists in. I'm saying this, that we must not, the West can't do anything about this problem. It may well be too late to do anything about it anyway. Let's be realistic, It may be too late for justice. There was no doubt a time when justice properly dispensed might have prevented that terrorism. It may be too late now. But even so, what happened, it's a long story, and I'm sorry, I don't want to bore anybody, and I can't tell all of it. What happened in the mid-decades of the 20th century, in my view, was that the West, for its own purposes, systematically rolled back and crushed leftist, nationalist, left nationalist, and revolutionary forces in the Arab world, including a massacre of some 500,000 communists in Indonesia, CIA-backed, and created a vacuum into which the ugly language of Islamism could then move. It was judged by the Middle East, it was judged by Muslims and Arabs in many places, quite understandably, that the left had been a failure. It hadn't defended them against the imperialist depredations of the right. I have to
say, this is all a caricature of history.
Against the right. You can come in a moment, Roger.
Yeah.
I've got about
I don't think there will be a moment if this goes on.
I've got another sentence, right? But you see, how often is this said? How often is this said? Give me my little moment on my little soapbox, yes? Because you won't hear it on Sky News, you won't hear it from him, you won't hear it from the BBC, you won't hear a history of that situation in which a political vacuum was created into which those forces were able to move, supported in Afghanistan, Islamic fundamentalism, supported by the United States. How often is that said?
Well, just a small point going back to the question. What is it that we in universities should be doing to confront this sort of thing? I think it's quite important to recognise the nature of the Enlightenment, the way in which it did transform our way of teaching culture to people in our civilization, and it's appropriate to lament the fact that that Enlightenment has not in any way taken root in the Islamic world. And I think it is quite important to compare the history of those great universities in the time that since the Enlightenment in Europe, what exactly happened to the Arab universities, and why was it that they didn't take on this critical attitude towards their own religion and the attempt to put it into context that we in the Christian world did. And I think, you're right that lots of things have been done wrong by the Western powers, but it wasn't the Western powers that invented Al-Wahhab, or sent him off to Saudi Arabia to do what he did. And it was his his stirring up of all that, which has led to so much of what is being said today.
It's simply the Western powers back Saudi Arabia today.
Of course,
I see no incompatibility between what I just said, Roger, and your very correct defence of the Enlightenment. I take what I said to be part of the Enlightenment.
Right.
That's to say that unless that it's a staple of Enlightenment, of Western Enlightenment, that unless you try to understand the historical context, the political context, all the things that your version of culture has been rejecting this evening, you won't win. You won't, you have to understand what you're up against. And you have to employ an Enlightenment rationality to understand that. And I certainly agree with your point. We have to understand the decline of that great tradition of Arab culture and learning. But what I began the evening by saying also was something about the decline of the great Western tradition. I think that we're less and less in a position where we can, as it were, look disdainfully on that, when we have moved ourselves from the great medieval institutions of Paris or Bologna or Oxford.
This is why we need ivory towers, isn't it?
To knowledge factories. And if the only alternatives we have are knowledge factory or ivory tower, we're finished.
More questions? There's a gentleman there.
Terry, your observation about the importance of culture and nation states now. But as I understand it, we're in an age which is no longer the age of empires, as Eric Hobsbawm, as I understand, referred to them as being, or that age as being. And that surely before that time, before the empires were as they were, you had this relationship between culture and national consciousness. It's part of the human condition. It's not something new, I would suggest. And so it's really the question you raise about the significance of it, to me, resonates as something fundamental about the human condition, which is not something that's happened in the 20th or the 21st century.
Sorry, what is it you see as fundamental about human condition?
It's this relation between national consciousness and a nation state, or a group of people of a separate identity who have a particular religion, and their culture. Because what it's telling you about those people or those states is that they have a particular consciousness which is based on their culture.
Well, you see, I think the very concept of the nation state was an attempt, as it were, to hyphenate together, nation, culture, a people's way of life, and state, to enshrine this, to institutionalize this, if you like, politically. And that, of course, was for a whole period an enormously powerful force in the world. I think part of the problem today is not that the nation state has vanished, by no means, but that its power is limited in various respects, that we live, of course, in a global capitalist world. And the question then is, what does culture make of that? Yes. Culture which has been narrowly nationalistic or chauvinistic isn't really able to make very much of that. Yes. On the other hand, a purely rootless postmodern cosmopolitan culture doesn't seem able to speak to certain deep demands and needs in people where they are. Yes? We're living, in other words, I think, in a kind of misalignment of the global on the one hand and the local on the other. And the problem is that these two things form a kind of stalled dialectic, because the more rootlessly global and brittly cosmopolitan people become, the more other people are going to retreat to their mountain hideouts and say, this is my patch, yeah? This is my nation or my region, keep off. Each of these realities, which is really back to the question of fundamentalism in a sense, keeps bringing the other into birth. Yeah?
I think I would just add to that one thought, which is that the high culture that we've been talking about in our civilization has not really been nationalistic. When I had an education which I'm sure is very similar to Terry's, in which I was brought up on the the sacred books of the ancient Hebrews, the Greek New Testament, the literature of Latin and the Latin literature of Rome, and the Greek epic, and the 1001 Nights, etc. There is just nowhere in this that you can really pin it down to a particular national inheritance, and that's part of the great achievement of Europe, that it has erected this high culture as a critical apparatus which enables us to put our national history in question if we need to.
Next question.
Yes, hello, gentlemen. One of the things that slightly disappointed me was that in your Mr. Eagleton's run through culture, how it's evolved, and not so much Roger Scruton's argument, was that you didn't seem to, you presented it from a very elitist position. Despite obviously your Marxist leanings and things, there was that is a political elitist position to some extent. And I think there was this, I felt that I just wanted it to be narrowed down a bit into this idea of culture as a meme, which historically has been controlled by the elite, be they the political elite or just the elite. And in the 20th century, what you've seen is the fact that instead of being, to use a capitalist expression, supply push, so that i.e. the meme that has been controlled by the elite has been controlled how the public, the majority, get hold of it. We've switched in an information world where the elite no longer control all the information channels to demand pull, which is the sort of Burke position. And the sad fact is that however romantic your position may be, Mr. Eagleton, that the demand is quite a low common denominator, that people are not that interested in using their brains, that they prefer pictures of things to interesting books or Beethoven. And that is how it is.
Are you accusing me of being elitist?
I am, yes.
Well, first of all, I don't actually see what I said, what was elitist in what I said. Secondly, elitism is a complex notion which I think shouldn't just be bandied around as a kind of swear word. For example, quite a lot, to revert to Roger's point about high culture, quite a lot of high culture is politically to the left of very much commercial media culture. Yeah? There's no similarity of axis between high and low and radical and conservative. I mean, it's traditionally part of the socialist position that culture must be more and more accessible to people. I thought that was part of what I was arguing. We can argue about we have to argue about the quality of culture. Some popular culture, once again, the axis of high and low is not coexistent with the axis of good and bad. There is some wonderful popular culture. Think of the history of film, okay? And there is some, to my mind, extremely third-rate so-called high culture. Many of the poems of Wordsworth, who wrote more lousy poetry than any other major poet. It's absolutely stereotypical thinking that there's, as it were, elite and mass, and the question is, which do you back? Is the elite good, or is popular culture good? Is the elite radical, or is popular good? This seems to me an utter simplification. Popular culture is an extraordinarily complex and divided field, which includes the most abysmal works, as well as some works of enduring quality. And just the same, in my view, is true of so-called high culture. Now, Roger, as it were, can evade that conclusion by saying, well, I don't call that high culture. If you want to identify high culture merely with works of great quality, fine, but that's not how it's been identified. High culture is canonical culture, institutionalized as the canon, and much in the canon is far, far worse than Seinfeld or Family Guy or the earlier Simpsons or the best episodes of The Office. Yeah? Yeah. The true elitists are those like Roger himself, who thinks that all of high culture is affirmative and the rest is dumbing down.
I'm not sure where you got that particular view from. I think of high culture in something like the spirit that you seem to be expressing, that it's a realm of critical reflection from which there emerges over time a canon. Sometimes there are things in the canon that shouldn't be there, but for the most part, the things are there because they have stood the test of time, have spoken to people, spoken to what is real and deep and lasting in people down the ages. And you only get that because of the critical reflection which leads to people throwing things out. You know, think of what's happened to all the contemporaries, the Bohemian contemporaries of Mozart. You don't even know their names. Because they didn't do anything that could remotely compare with Don Giovanni.
Gentleman here.
Seems to me you're not really facing up to the point that the gentleman to my right was making, which is that you both agree that the culture that you're talking about, the quality culture, I know that isn't the phrase you use, that's my phrase, but the quality culture, whether it's Shakespeare or Mozart or even film or some of the things that Terry mentioned in his last answer, that those forms of culture are confined to a relatively small number of people. And I think what the gentleman was trying to say, and it's certainly my view, is that the issue is to what extent it is realistically possible to spread that form of culture much, much more widely. That was certainly a very strong aspiration at the time when I was at university, I'm afraid, at exactly the same place as both of you. And people like Arnold Wesker talked very, very fervently about the desirability of cheapening the price of theatre tickets so that the masses could come to the theatre and so on. In the last 40 or 50 years, that really hasn't happened, has it? And it seems to me that that, put in probably much cruder terms than you have done, is what you're really complaining about, both of you, what you're really expressing anxiety about, which raises the purely practical question, assuming that people agree that that's what's wrong, how do we change it? How do we redress the concerns which, admittedly, in very different ways, you're both expressing?
Can I just...
Roger?
Sorry.
Well, I think it is very important to raise this question, but and go back to the previous questioner. The answer has to be looked in one of two places. Do we change the habit of supply, or do we change the habit of demand? If it is all motivated by the suppliers, you're in trouble. Well, the suppliers of film, of the television programs, and so on. If the people who are supplying the culture are simply doing whatever achieves the largest market, the biggest possible sales, the widest audience, then you have the whole problem that we are living through of pornography and so on, where we seem to be in a complete free-for-all of utterly valueless and perhaps morally destructive things. But if, on the other hand, you think that it's the demand that should be motivating the production of culture, then you must address the question of how you educate that demand, how you get into people's heads something of the old sense of taste, that this is bad, and this I don't want to pollute myself with that, but I'm going to concentrate on getting the kind of mind and the kind of interest that will enable me to go away from my cultural experiences with a sense of being, in some sense, raised up by them.
So it's a good thing that you aim to have half the population at university.
Well, there is the question of what happens to universities when half the people in them can't read.
I was going to take some more questions. Gentlemen there. And are there women with questions to ask? Lady there, yes.
Actually, I think the BBC should give both these gentlemen a series. It would be interesting to see them comment on all sorts of things every year. But my question is partly to do with cultural criticism and partly to do with education. I think and I stress part of the reason why perhaps there are many leftist ideologies and theories dominating academia, and have done for a very long while, is there hasn't been a rival scientific, or for scientific read materialist, theory of cultural criticism, as it were, from the right. I was just wondering, Professor Scruton, if you thought there could be, as it were, conservative idea of cultural criticism theory that did look at economic structures, perhaps identifying unjust ideologies that might exist, etc., etc., etc. Would that fit within a conservative ideological mindset? But by the same token, if Terry Eagleton accepts that culture can carry good tradition, traditio, paradoxes, wisdom as opposed to mere custom like changing of the guards, by what means do you discern what we may rightly regard as wisdom? And the education part of the question was just simply, as a means of countering the negative aspects of contemporary academia that you both identify, what do you think of the development of new liberal arts colleges, like the new idea of Benedictus College, a new Catholic liberal arts college, which would teach humane studies, a BA in humane studies, that is, the whole rounded education that used to be taught in London?
Roger?
Well, that's three huge questions. I would say that just on that last little question, I'm all in favour of new initiatives, especially when institutions are failing to produce what we are looking at them to produce. Then what other alternative is there? We don't want to dictate from above some utopian scheme, but we do, I think what we should do is allow people to develop things and see how far they get. And I'm all in favour of Benedictus College and also of Tony Grayling's enterprise, which is obviously much more secular. I think both. I just hope both succeed, and everything is multiplied. On the question of whether there can be a conservative critique of culture, I would say this: that if there were such a thing, it wouldn't have the form that cultural theory has tended to have. I say it wouldn't be an attempt to trace culture to its economic roots or to the power structures, the structures of domination, etc., the class structure of society that allegedly produces it and requires it. And that, I think, one could leave that to the Marxists and they'd make the usual mess of it. And I would say that there should be something which is a kind of internal study of culture, according to the norms that culture itself produces, the norms of human understanding. This is something we haven't touched on, but I think that probably Terry might agree with this, that there are forms of human understanding, what the Germans call Verstehen, which are not reducible to these scientific categories, and that is perhaps what culture primarily should be teaching us.
The trouble with the right that and he doesn't see, he won't even accept the word right.
Yes, no, in the other sense, I do.
The trouble with the right is that they have a lot of theories, they just don't like calling them theories, see, because they're so deeply invested in intuition, feeling, common sense, what tradition spontaneously tells you, what you carry in your bones without a need to argue, that the very notion of theory as a relatively systematized way of thinking is distasteful and offensive to them. So, they're in the grip of certain theories to be sure, but they just don't call them theories. That point relates perhaps to the point the last speaker was making, how does one judge this wisdom that culture is supposed to distill? Well, the only thing you can say, surely, is you've got to argue about it. What you can't do is accept passively certain values which you're handed by certain cultural autocrats. You're told that these are the values to take, and either you take them or you don't. That has been a very traditional conservative way of thinking. And this is, as it were, partly also my answer to the question that you were raising. Raymond Williams said pointed out, very wisely I think, that you never simply extend a value to whole new groups of people without it being open to being changed by them, to being actively remade. That's a good old socialist case, and that's what the right is very nervous of. They see transmission essentially in terms of passively taking over values which have been determined from elsewhere. That's the true kind of elitism. If, however, you believe, as Raymond Williams believed, in accessibility, that you're going to have to risk these values being argued with, debated, contested, transformed, maybe rejected, then to return to your question, which I think was a very valuable one, Williams said he would have expected that he was talking about the Attlee government, any Labour government that was serious about as it were, culture, would have established institutions of popular and adult culture and education, which we still have marginally and residually in the embattled but very brave adult education movement, and so on.
On what standard would you argue? You said argue about it. Argue on what basis? By what standard?
Well, you would say, I think this is wise, and I'd say, no, it isn't. And then you'd say something, and then I'd say something. Have you never listened to people arguing? I mean, we don't need some transcendental criteria that we have both to subscribe to in order to argue.
We do if we want to believe there's a right answer.
No. There are all kinds of right answers. Roger would certainly agree as a philosopher, which are not which are not foundational or transcendental in any way. I mean, they're judgments.
Last question from the lady there. Wait for the mic.
I wanted to ask about one of the things that has come up frequently in your discussion today, the idea of belonging. But where there's belonging, there is exclusion. And when we say that high culture or good culture, valuable culture allows us to get to know ourselves and our surroundings, people around us, we may run the risk of implying that there is a universal human self that we can all discover through culture. And I ask this because one of the things that has been conspicuously absent this evening is the mention of non-Western cultures. And what happens, so the question is really, what happens when there is a clash of high cultures, of different worlds? And I think this is where, Terry, your point is extremely valid about the political power structures that cultures are mired in. And colonialism is a very good example of that. So, the debate between high culture, low culture, valuable culture, invaluable culture might be easier if you're talking about Shakespeare and Justin Bieber. But if you're talking about Hindustani Carnatic music or Shakespeare, then the debate is much more complicated. And this is precisely where the politics of the world comes into play, because it's not one seriously good culture rubbishing the other. It is one very good culture rubbishing a very good culture.
I would like to say something in response to this, because I think it is a very important issue, which bears on what we mean by culture when we discuss it in the way that we've been discussing it. Looking at the case of India, which is obviously in the back of your mind, you have to think of what happened when the Asiatic Society of Bengal was founded in something like 1785. That was founded by the first sort of group of British civil servants working for the East India Company, who were really amazed by what they found around themselves and wanted to learn it. They came with their Enlightenment attitudes that this is culture too, and did a lot to save the Sanskrit texts. And Sir William Jones, in particular, did his own bit to save the tradition of Indian classical music, which was being lost at the time. And this kind of universal education that people had then enabled them to see India, at least that class of people, to see India as another high culture which they had to not only respect but try and immortalize, get it into print even, where it hadn't been in print before. And more recent scholars have always looked back on colonialism as some kind of threat, some kind of way of oppressing or wiping out the native culture. And it's just not true in the case of the British in India, because of that Enlightenment view of culture as a universal thing. But it's you're not going to agree, but I'm telling you this nevertheless.
One of the things that the British media also did, for example, was to forbid...
Sooty, yeah, of course they stopped you burning widows and so on, I agree.
Sorry, stop. She wasn't burning widows.
Oh, carry on.
Yeah, that's a valid point. But no, I mean, we can go on and on about the history of the British Empire, and believe you me, that there will be more examples of the Enlightenment culture being lost on a great many number of civil servants in British India. So I wouldn't go that far. But I think one of the important questions that I would like to hear your thoughts on is what do we do about the political establishment today in a globalized world, which seems to be democratic in its embrace of plurality and multiculturalism and so on and so forth. But there is still a hierarchy. And how do we square that circle now? We still live in a divided and hegemonic world in some ways.
I think this is Terry's question, because he has solutions to these problems, and he knows exactly who should be taken away and put where.
Whereas there's something superior in not having solutions.
No, I think that I think some problems are insoluble.
It is. Roger's example is outrageously tendentious. It's not untrue of the Bengali. It's just outrageously tendentious. If implicitly you're using that as a paradigm of the relation between Western and colonized cultures, the fact is that not only did the West destroy local cultures in colonialism, as Roger knows full well, but one very important historical function of so-called Western high culture that Roger defends is that it was a way in which you could, as it were, package your values very conveniently and show them to the natives, yes, and impress them. Culture travelled. Literature, the arts, particularly writing, was a way in which, as it were, you could encapsulate those values and use them in colonial situations. So much so that, as I was saying before, there's no correlation between high and popular culture and good and bad culture or left and right culture. Equally, your point is there is high culture all over the place. Just as the media are all over the place, so is so-called high culture. But it's been part of the arrogance of a certain Western cultural imperialism that high culture itself is identified with the West. Yes.
Actually, I don't agree with that at all. If you look at what happened to Western high culture under the influence of the East, okay, you're going to say that something like Rudyard Kipling's Kim is simply Western high culture taken into India. I don't think it's true at all. It was an attempt, actually, to bring to life that extraordinary society, an extraordinary mixture of cultures that surrounded him. Think of things like Puccini's Madama Butterfly, or Benjamin Britten's Prince of the Pagodas, or Curlew River. The way in which throughout the impact of the Eastern cultures in the 20th century, artists and writers and composers have tried to absorb it and create gestures of respect, which show that they've at least tried to understand that there is something there which is a difference and not just an assimilation.
I think we're starting to run out of time now. So, Roger, would you like to make just a brief closing statement summing up your
That sounded like a good closing statement to me.
Terry, would you like to come back at all with anything?
I'd rather use the time just for a final question.
That's absolutely fine, yes. One more question. Lady there in the green dress.
Hi, my question is directed mostly at Roger. I'd like to talk, because so much conversation has been about the kind of cultural analysis and interrogation that goes on within universities. I would like to very quickly make the point that that kind of deconstructive vein that you associate with Marxist criticism hasn't just been about what to throw out of the canon, it's also been about what to include in it. I recently had a lecture in 18th century history which didn't mention slavery at all, and I kind of think a good Marxist critic would be like, no, the single biggest economic activity, we should include that in our study of 18th century literature. And in terms of your point about the decline of pop music, I think good Marxist criticism would try and look at things like hip hop, jazz, and include them within your canon of high culture that you associate predominantly with Western music. Do you agree that there's a great deal of critical interrogation of culture and cultural expression which occurs outside of universities, and that can encode the kind of tensions that have been thrown about between the two of you much better than anything that has been taught in universities, which kind of comes out with hegemonic blocks of knowledge and received wisdom?
It's a huge question. I'm of the view that in the end, a healthy culture can't just be confined to universities, and we desperately need all that tradition of discussion through reviews and through ordinary interaction of people, which actually makes cultural products into part of their lives. If we thought that it was just in universities that we talked about art or music or something, then of course the whole thing would atrophy. It wouldn't have the place in people's lives that it should have. On the question of popular music, it is interesting that the only serious attempt to include popular music into the musicological theories that have been propagated in universities was made by Marxists, in particular by Adorno, the Frankfurt School, by way of condemning the whole damn thing as rubbish. It was a very distressing episode, which actually set musicology back a long way, because his targets were precisely they were jazz, Gershwin, Cole Porter, and so on. All that moment in American popular culture where it actually seemed to justify itself as making a real contribution, and it's had a very bad effect, of course. The question what to do now, though, how to bring into the curriculum things like hip hop and so on, while retaining one's respect for all the things that it disrespects, is another problem.
I'm not sure how much hip hop you've listened to. It sounded like you only listened to music made by dead white men from all the Mozart.
Yes, well, that's what you've been taught to say, but that's a total cliche.
Adorno indeed was disastrously wrong about jazz, as Roger so rightly says. What Roger doesn't say, and I think it's a symptomatic silence, is Adorno also was extraordinarily acute about how musical values were degraded and debased by a cynical capitalist Hollywood manipulation of them. And that, I think, is of enduring value in the study of popular culture. Let me just finish by saying, there's one thing I want to say, just reverting to the theme of religion. Religion, one of the reasons why culture didn't take over from religion, there are thousands of them, is that religion is far and away the most pervasive, persistent, tenacious, enduring form of popular culture, and I think Roger will agree here, that history has ever witnessed. You won't find it on a single cultural studies course.
On that note, I think we're going to have to end. We've run out of time. Terry and Roger will be signing books out on the landing, but please show your appreciation with a very large round of applause. Thank you very much.